Mark, first, let's talk about what a shutdown actually is. It's not really a full shutdown, right?
No, so you have to understand only a quarter of the budget is funded out of appropriations. So as a starting point, the shutdown only affects the Department of Defense and then some of the core functions of things like EPA and Interior and Department of Education. But then on top of that, a lot of that quarter budget continues to go. It just moves without people being paid, or rather with them paid on a delay. And so more than half of that quarter, in fact, basically everyone in the military and half of the rest continues to function on just a slower basis.
Yeah. Mark, I think that's a very important point because it's not really a shutdown. Shutdown sounds like they turn off the lights, everybody goes home, all the essential services stop. I was there during shutdowns, and it was remarkable to me that the public barely noticed that there was a shutdown, right? Has that been your experience?
I think it depends on the length of the shutdown and where you live. Certainly, if you're applying for a visa application or if you're trying to go to a national park, you're going to notice. But a typical person on a typical day probably won't be able to tell the difference.
Yeah, you raised a good point. The national parks is where we heard about it. So it depends on the time of year because that was probably the most practical impact on people. Now, the shutdowns also roil the financial markets, right? But interestingly, if you look at the past trends, there have been short-term negative reactions, but nothing that the market hasn't recovered from in a relatively short period of time, literally in a couple of weeks. So even though the markets get very nervous about those two words, shut down, on the past experiences, as we can see on the chart, you have the market rebounding. Sometimes you have the market rebounding even higher than it was before the shutdown. So that also has to be taken in context. Because again, yes, short-term roiling, but there have been long-term gains. Does that make sense to you?
Even some of that short-term riling, some of these government shutdowns have coincided with also an issue over the debt limit. If we breach the debt limit, that means we are not paying the money we actually owe. When we shut down the government, that means federal employees, some of them are going to be sent home, and others are going to be asked to work and paid later. It's a completely different situation. The markers look at both and say, oof, this means Washington is pretty broken. And so it's not, neither of them are good. But they look at the shutdown and they say, oof, this means Washington is pretty broken, but there's not really major economic implications to the shutdown itself, which is very different from the debt limit breach that could actually cause some kind of financial crisis.
Yeah, Mark, stay with that for a second, please, because it's a little complicated and I don't think people get it. What's the difference between a government shutdown and an impasse on the debt limit?
Yeah, so Congress is supposed to fund about a quarter of the budget every year through these appropriations. We go on a one-year budget at a time. A shutdown is basically what happens when they fail to pass that budget on time. And even when they fail to pass it, most of the agencies continue operating. They just operate with more skeleton staff. The debt limit is a totally different situation. The debt limit is a cap on how much we're allowed to issue in borrowing. And since we're borrowing about $2 trillion a year, if we breach that cap, it's really bad news because it either means the president needs to unilaterally decide to make major spending cuts that he maybe doesn't have the legal authority to do, or he needs to stop paying interest on the debt. And either one of those is a form of default. And so that debt limit breach, that's a really big deal and could be really dangerous.
Yeah.
The government shutdown, that's not good. It's bad. It shouldn't happen. It's unnecessary chaos. But it shouldn't cause major economic calamity of any kind.
Yeah, I agree. And unnecessary chaos. That's an interesting concept in Washington. Unnecessary chaos we wouldn't have a federal government. But this seems like it's more of a intramural political debate in Washington. You have Speaker McCarthy. Speaker McCarthy needs basically every vote, every member to pass a bill. And he has some people who he has a very difficult time with, who are on the extreme side. And that's really the political dynamic that is at work here, wouldn't you say?
Yeah, the House is not able to put together a bill that can get essentially universal support among the majority. And there really are two options when you're facing a shutdown. The one is to pass all the appropriations bills, and they are nowhere close on that. And the House wants to go way below what was agreed to in the debt limit agreement. The Senate actually wants to go above it. They're loads apart. But the second option is to do what's called a continuing resolution, which just kicks the can and basically continues last year's funding for a week, for a month, for a few months. And what's interesting is the House is not even able to get agreement so far on that kick the can move to live to die another day.
Yeah. This is a little inside speak, but I enjoy it. Continuing resolutions don't happen in state government, right? But continuing, not in this state government anyway, we need a balanced budget. The continuing resolutions are quite common, and the federal government has operated for a long time on a continuing resolution, which basically says, let's just take last year's budget, continue with last year's budget, we'll tweak it here, we'll tweak it there. But that has almost been the rule, hasn't it, that government has operated on continuing resolutions?
Yeah, more or less. We've only actually passed all the appropriation bills on time twice since the budget process, since the modern budget process. Ordinarily, we have at least one continuing resolution. They're not supposed to fund the government for the whole year, but they do buy time to come to agreement on those major appropriations bills.
Yeah. And I think what Speaker McCarthy is dealing with is he has some members in the House who ran on the point that they basically wanted to burn down the House. They wanted to shut down the federal government. And for them, this is a great gesture to their constituents of shutting down the government, right? It's as close as you can come to shutting down the government is by saying, I refuse to vote for the budget. So I think for some of his members, it's a very powerful political point to take. I went to Washington, I showed them I wouldn't vote for the budget, and we shut down government, even though it's not really a shutdown.
Look, I understand that, but I also think it's a little bit silly because eventually the government will be reopened. And if you're someone that cares about cutting spending, shrinking government, and I care about cutting deficits, this doesn't do any of that. In fact, we keep paying federal employees not to work. So government shutdowns don't save money, they waste money. Can
McCarthy pull off a continuing resolution here with some tweaks to parts of the budget? Do you think that's in the cards?
That's what he's trying to figure out. He's trying to figure out if he could do a continuing resolution that maybe cuts the levels a little bit or includes some border security. The issue he's dealing with is that the rule used to be the majority, that the speaker wouldn't put something out unless he could get the majority of his own party. But under Speaker McCarthy, the rule has kind of shifted to almost unanimous support of the majority. He could lose maybe 2 or 3 members. And that's a very different dynamic, especially when the House and the president are controlled by the Democrats.
Yeah. No, I agree 100%. He's in a very bad place. He was elected into a very bad place because when you need almost 100% and you have a contingent of, I would call them extremists in his party, it's a very difficult situation. And we saw it with his election, right? So when there's a time to act out and make a political statement like passing a budget, that's a perfect opportunity for part of his constituency to stand up. There's talk that maybe McCarthy could make a deal with Democrats and use Democratic support to pass a budget. Now, that gets into really three-dimensional chess politics. If he makes a deal with the Democrats would require something in return. And that would enrage, I believe, McCarthy's supporters. And to me, it sounds like he would be crossing the abyss, and I don't know that you come back from the abyss. What do you think?
Well, I think at some point will be legislation that will have Democrats on it. There's no bill I can think of that's Republican only in the House that can also pass the Senate and be signed by the president. So to me, it's a question of when, not of if. Speaker McCarthy ultimately is going to need a bill that has both Democrats and Republicans signing on to it.
Now, if McCarthy passes a bill and he uses Democrats to substitute for his more extreme conservative members, doesn't that trigger for him that death penalty clause that they inserted when they elected him, that any one person can get up and call for a vote?
He's in a tough spot. Look, what we saw with the Fiscal Responsibility Act was the House passed their opening offer, Republican only, and then he negotiated with the White House, and then they passed the final bill with a mixture of Republicans and Democrats. And the Speaker lived to die another day. Again, he didn't get canceled. Yeah. But I don't know if the same thing is going to happen this time. He's certainly walking on eggshells.
Mark, what happens with the relatively small issue but important issue? What happens to the Ukraine funding in the midst of this? Why has that become such a political football?
Yeah. So there's sort of three pots of Ukraine funding. There's the roughly $120 billion that we've already appropriated, and that's actually continuing to go. It hasn't all been sent out. A lot of it's in the form of sending them stuff, weapons and things like that. That won't really be affected. The second is there's a small amount of aid that's just part of the regular budget that will go to the Ukraine. I know there's some discussion over that, and there are a few House members that don't want that. But generally, that's just a continuation of what we've been doing. I don't think it's in major danger. Big question is, will we appropriate more funding for Ukraine? The White House has asked for, I think, $30 billion or so. And what's interesting is Republicans are very divided on this. There are some that are sort of gung-ho supporters of this Ukraine funding, and some that are gung-ho opponents of it. So it's not even a partisan thing. It's within the party. Democrats have some similar divisions, but they seem softer, and they're not airing them in public, at least. So we'll see if the Ukraine money makes it easier to pass this CR or actually harder. It really depends on what coalition is working to pass it.
Good. So let's recap. Possibility of a shutdown, but a shutdown is not really a shutdown. A shutdown, from the public's point of view, may be non-consequential for many, many people. National parks, visas, immigration, etc. But otherwise, and as I mentioned, I went through this, the world did not stop spinning on its axis. There's a difference between a shutdown because you can't reach a budget versus a debt limit ceiling, which is serious, and this is not that. And this is totally entangled with McCarthy's politics and his being able to deliver enough Republicans to pass it, and then having the conundrum of, does he do it with Democrats, and what happens if he does it with Democrats? And can he get to basically a compromise, which is a continuing resolution that carries forward last year's budget with some tweaks, which is not especially new or novel because that's happened before. Is that a fair summary?
Yeah, I think that's pretty right. One thing I will say is the longer the shutdown goes, the more people will feel it. It does make it hard to apply for any kind of government programs. It is going to create backlogs. It is going to make things difficult for state and local governments counting on federal funding. So the longer it goes, I think the more broadly it will be felt. It's never going to be like a debt limit breach. It's not going to melt down the global economy, but it's not good, and it is quite wasteful.
Yeah, you also raise a good point. The state and local funding stops, and now state and locals have a balance. They can float for a while, but if it goes on long, it could make a difference. But probably the overall impact is, once again, to the world, the federal government looks like it's dysfunctional, and which I don't know that is going to be news to anyone. Okay, that was a fair synopsis. Here's an unfair question. They tell me that you have a crystal ball on your desk that you are not showing right now. Take a look at that crystal ball and tell me, will there be a government shutdown or not?
You know, I never bet, especially about the future, but we've been surveying some top budget experts to get their thoughts, and the numbers just came in this morning, and they think there's a 87% chance of a shutdown. So I'm going to say yes, there will be a shutdown.
87%?
87%.
That's high.
Mm-hmm. I voted 70% for what it's worth, but others were at 90 or even 100.
Really? All right. Well, time will tell. Marc, thank you very, very much for taking the time to be with us. It's been very informative. Thank you for delineating the differences between the shutdown and the debt limit and the actual consequences to people. 87%. We shall see. Marc Goldwein, thank you very much for being with us.
Thank you.